the first one was considered like a DUI minor. These two were DWIs. And so they didn't take kindly to that, and they put me on house arrest. I had an ankle monitor, and I, could have basically only go to class and come back home to the house. And I found my way around that. I would just have parties at the house, and, I was still selling drugs, and nothing seemed to slow me down, because like drugs and alcohol were my solution to this emptiness and this longing and this yearning and all this pain that I had felt like my entire life, Hey, Nick Lambeth, this is my testimony. Where did it all start? I was born in Austin, Texas. Was raised by a single mom and my grandma, and had a pretty normal childhood growing up. Played outside a lot, played a lot of sports. Really just kind of grew up a normal young man. But I think early on there were definitely some deep wounds that kind of formed as a result of, my dad had some struggles of his own, struggled with alcoholism and drug addiction, and, ran in some pretty rough circles, and, was a gang member, and dealt drugs and that whole lifestyle. So he was in prison, from the time I was pretty much born, a few months old, until, when I was about 10 years old or so. So I remember like always kind of feeling like something was missing, like almost just like a deep sense of a lack of worth, or kind of questioning why everyone else seemed to have a family and kind of a home with married parents and things like that. And I would go to like baseball games and sporting events, and I would see kind of the dads with their sons and things like that. And I just remember like, I guess internalizing that as a kid, you don't really understand. So I remember thinking like, well, what's wrong with me? What did I do? Or like, why am I not like lovable, or, and looking back, like, I understand that. But as a kid, like I couldn't quite like put a finger on what that was. It just felt like an emptiness and like a longing and a yearning that I couldn't really understand. And so that kind of stuck with me, going through my early years. And Dad got out of prison. I was about like 10 years old or so. And he came back and kind of, lived with us. And that was like the first time when I was like, oh man, like, I finally got a shot at a family and a dad. Like, this is great. And, it was for a little bit. But, old habits die hard, I guess. And, he looking back now, I can understand and have empathy and compassion for like what he had walked through, but then it's like, he was back to his old ways pretty quickly, and was pretty violent and abusive, physically, emotionally, and verbally, to my mom and to myself. And, Mom came home one day and he was basically cooking drugs in the garage with some of his old gang members, and she kicked him out of the house. And I remember like being mad at her. Obviously I didn't know that had happened. This is being like told back to me, as an adult. But I just remember being like so angry that like I finally got this shot at like having a family and having a father and all these things, and that that was basically ripped away from me again. And, that's when the anger really started to take a stronghold, just a root of bitterness in my heart, about 10, 11 years old. And it was pretty short after that my mom, started dating someone else. And, he shortly moved in with us, and they got engaged. And, here was kind of this second glimpse at like, okay, cool. Like, well, maybe this is, a chance for me to have a family and have a home where, where it kind of resembles what I had seen with other kids and just growing up. And it was good for a little while, but he ended up struggling with alcoholism as well, and those true colors kind of started to shine through, when I was about 12, 13, same thing. Like, And this was where I was really confused because, he would drink and become this one person, very abusive physically, never to my mom, but mainly to me. And, but then we would go to mass on Sundays, right? And it was like this kind of dichotomy of, hypocrisy, like showing up one way on a Sunday and then being like a completely different person. And it really confused me as to who God is. And, I remember there was one specific night where, he had come home really, really drunk. He was a blackout drinker. And we just got, physical and abusive, and I kind of ran outside. And I remember just like staring up and just being like, God, like, why are you allowing this? Like if this is the kind of God you are, then like I pretty much want nothing to do with you from here on out. And, that was really kind of a pivotal moment because up until that point, I had like hope that like it was going to get better. And it just kept getting worse and worse, and I didn't understand it as a kid. And so yeah, that's when I kind of like started trying to like escape, the emotional pain and confusion and just the deep wounds that had formed through drugs. I started, smoking weed probably about like 12, 13 years old. And, I was pretty much high for the next like 10 years. After that, really didn't draw a sober breath. That kind of escalated into harder drugs, and I became a blackout drinker by 16, 17. Before that, I guess I had, my mom had their first kid, my brother Luke, and he had Down syndrome and a heart defect at birth, and he needed surgery like 4 months old or so. And so time kind of like, I guess, stopped there, and that's when I really had to grow up because I kind of like lost a mother in a sense because she was, going through a lot, struggled with like postpartum depression and the abuse was going on. And so basically I was like, hey, I can't like live in this environment anymore, and I was like, hey, like either you leave this marriage or like I'm gone, I can't be around this, And for like a 13-year-old to have to like make that decision, looking back, like that's pretty heavy. And anyway, she stayed in the marriage, and I went and lived with my grandma, and that's kind of when like the drug use took off, and there was like a lot of back and forth. And long story short, I don't know if I was always an alcoholic. There is a genetic component to that, or if it was the environment, nature versus nurture. Either way, I became a blackout drinker, as I mentioned, by 16, 17, selling drugs, having sex, had a pretty healthy porn addiction from, the time I was like 12 or 13 on, right? I had this conscious seeming separation from myself, from people around me, from God, right? I just felt completely isolated and alone, and I didn't know how to cope with that. And the only thing that would alleviate that feeling of emptiness and loneliness and despair was drugs and alcohol and sex, right? And so I chased that, and I got my, started having consequences. I was in a relationship at the time, and, that was starting to crumble. I was pretty much unable to really have any true vulnerability or intimacy with anyone because I just didn't trust. I couldn't let anyone close enough to me because I had, been hurt so much by those closest to me. And, I started getting consequences. There was a couple of times I collapsed, from, overdoses, and there were car accidents, and, I got my first DUI. Yeah, so my trouble with the law started pretty early on. I was pretty much on probation from the time I was like 14 until, 25, 26. But yeah, I got my first DUI, as I mentioned, at 17. Next year I went off to college, got another DWI, joined a fraternity, and, things just kind of escalated, right? And, while I was out on bond for that DWI, I got another one about 9 months after that. And this was in San Antonio, Texas, because I had gone to the University of Texas, San Antonio. And by the third one, the first one was considered like a DUI minor. These two were DWIs. And so they didn't take kindly to that, and they put me on house arrest. You know, I had an ankle monitor, and I, you know, could basically only go to class and come back home to the house. And you know, I found my way around that. I would just have parties at the house, and, you know, I was still selling drugs, and nothing seemed to slow me down, you know, because like drugs and alcohol were my solution to this emptiness and this longing and this yearning and all this pain that I had felt like my entire life, you know. So I would just constantly rationalize the decisions that I was making, and you know, no matter the consequences, I just kept rearranging things to continue, you know, using and drinking the way that I wanted to, you know, and having sex and all these things that just took me out of this emptiness, you know, that I had felt. And but you know, eventually I realized that hey, this is actually a problem, and I started wanting to actually stop, you know. And you know, I feel like sometimes we don't realize the power of sin until we actually start trying to resist it. And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey to realizing my powerlessness to change, you know, on my own. And no matter what I tried, man, I could not stop drinking. I couldn't stop using. I couldn't stop having sex. I couldn't stop watching porn. All these things that were destroying me, I couldn't stop, even though I wanted to. And I tried, you know, not drinking liquor and only drinking beer. I tried only drinking on weekends. I tried only smoking weed. I tried, you know, only doing like a Xanax here and there. And it always spiraled out of control, and I would end up, you know, deeper down the hole, you know, each and every time. And so I thought, you know, okay, cool, maybe the problem is these people in this place that I'm at, and I just need to get away, right? And so I transferred to LSU in Baton Rouge my junior year, and just wanted a fresh start, right? I was like, hey, maybe I can get a fresh start, maybe I can get a handle on things. And picked up basically right where I left off, you know, only this time I'm, you know, in another state with, you know, new people around, and you know, it kept getting worse and worse. And long story short, I you know, started really getting into some pretty heavy drugs and drinking, and, you know, the blackouts became more frequent, and I was just basically missing like whole chunks of my life, and I would wake up in strange places with strange people and not know how I'd gotten there. And the terror and the bewilderment and the confusion and the emptiness and hopelessness had really just grown and grown and grown until the solution of drugs and alcohol no longer worked. You know, I wasn't able to experience that ease and comfort, that peace. I could no longer escape, you know, the things that I was essentially running from. And, you know, I remember one time after, you know, a particular blackout, I had woken up in this hotel hallway and, you know, not known how I had gotten there. And basically it became a pattern that I would just have to be like told back, like what I did, what I had said, basically, you know, where I had been. And that was like normal to me. So I go downstairs and I ask her how I got there. And she basically just tells me, yeah, man, you came in just like screaming and yelling, and we basically just let you tire yourself out and pass out in the hotel hallway, you know. And I remember like, you know, them letting me into the room and me just kind of like hitting my knees. And, you know, I had always kind of like prayed and you know, like foxhole prayers, just like, you know, when I would get in trouble with the law or whatever, like God help me or something. But in that moment, that was kind of the first, like, I guess, step towards surrender that I had taken, because I was just like, look, God, like, I've tried counseling, I've tried priests, I've tried, you know, managing, I've tried moving, I've tried all these things, and nothing works, right? And I was like, please help me. And, you know, I had kind of a physical experience of like the presence of God. I didn't know that's what it was. Yeah, I mean, I got goosebumps all over my body. The hair stood up on like the back of my neck, and you know, I experienced just like a lightness that was very uncharacteristic of, you know, all of the weight and the heaviness and the pain and the sorrow that I had been carrying all those years, you know. And I was about 20 at this point, and, you know, it had been pretty bad since I was like 12. So for the last 8 years, I'd really known nothing but heaviness and sadness. And it was, it was a split second moment, but I felt that lift and I was sober, you know what I mean? And so the only thing that had worked up to that point was like drugs and alcohol and sex and porn and all these other things. So that was the first moment I experienced like peace outside of like running to those things. And then, I go back and I think some guys from the Christian fraternity on campus, Brothers Under Christ, were inviting people to church. They had like some campus fair or something, like, hey, come to church. And, I was familiar with kind of church, growing up, going to mass for that period of time. And I was like, sure, why not? And so I go to church and, I meet some guys and, they invite me to a Bible study and they're like, hey, we're having this retreat. And they're like, do you want to come? I was like, sure, like I'll go, And I started, I remember I was in like church service one day and it's called The Refuge. And it was a night service and the pastor was just preaching and shared just the simple gospel. And it was like the first time I had ever heard it, like I actually had ears to hear that like there was a God who loved me so much that he would give his son. And that his son actually, went to the cross to reconcile me and forgive me for all of the things that I had done. And that there was that bridge back to a connection with a God that I had felt so separated from for so many years. And I had never really understood that or heard that, like, when I was going to mass or anything like that. And so things really started to kind of like shift in me, I think, after that point. And I think that's a big reason why I agreed to go on the retreat and was going to these Bible studies. And so we went on the retreat and, there were a couple guitars and they started kind of leading a worship session. And about, seconds into worship, I just break down and I start bawling. And I don't really know why, it wasn't anything specific, but it was like basically just the years and years and years of like all of that pain, all of that heaviness, all of those burdens, all of the sorrow, all of the pain and things that I had been carrying were just taken away, like in an instant. And, it was like what I had gotten a taste of, after that time in the hotel, but this was it, everything just flooded in. And, I felt like I was like lifted like off the ground, because like everything just like completely like fell away in this like peace and this rest and this contentedness and this joy that I didn't understand. Like I had never really, it had been a long, long time since I experienced any of that. And so, I had that experience. I must have been bawling for like half an hour, straight. And that's when, I came back and things started to change. My desires were shifting around. I no longer, wanted to get drunk and be out in the bars and, be having sex and watching porn and like all of these things that I had not really found that objectionable or maybe I had started finding objectionable, but had just ceded to the fact that like that's just the way things were. Those desires started to be reordered in my heart, and I started to, kind of seek different things and seek out, healthy community. But I wish I could say that like things changed and I never looked back. But, for my story, that hasn't been the case. I was still leading a double life. I wasn't really ready to surrender fully to this life that God was calling me into. So I kind of like distanced myself, because I think like I was still in a lot of guilt and shame about my past and the way that I was living currently. I was still selling drugs. I was still out at the bars and, hooking up and kind of living that life. But, then on Sundays, I'm like showing up in church and I just felt like a hypocrite, and instead of like, I still couldn't trust people enough to actually let them into that. And so instead, I just distanced myself as I always did. And long story short, spiraled down, ended up getting, 4th DWI. And this time, they put an ankle monitor on my ankle that was like taking my sweat every 30 minutes so I couldn't drink. And, found my way out of that. I got a breathalyzer on my car and left it in Texas, and basically came back and was doing the exact same thing. And so was facing prison. This time it was a felony. And, I'm still running 100 miles an hour trying to, live the life that I was living. And, I was still like, I would have these moments of clarity where I was like, I have to stop doing this. And maybe I would have periods of time where I could stop, and stay sober and kind of like get back on track. But that would always be followed inevitably by, me digging a deeper hole and a deeper hole and a deeper hole. And, one night I had an exam the next day, and I had promised myself that I wasn't going to drink anymore, and I was going to get sober, and I was going to get it together. And I ended up, being offered a drink after, I waited tables through college, and someone pushed a drink my way, and I took it. And next thing I know, and this was kind of how it was with me, is I never knew where that first drink was going to take me. And this time it took me to, I was in a casino. It was like 7 a.m. I'm high on cocaine and however much tequila. And, I come home and it's daytime, and I have a test in a couple hours. And that was bottom, for me. Essentially I was just like, I can't keep living like this. I'm going to die. But I can't imagine life without this, because like it was so terrifying. Actually facing the music and looking at potential prison time and cleaning up all of the mess I had made in relationships and the harm that I had caused along the way. I pretty much just had the thought of like, well, I'm just going to end it. I had my rifle in the closet, and it was a very like quiet moment that like was like terrified me, because I had like thought about it before, but never like seriously considered actually doing it. But this time, like I was like really considering it. And, I had a thought that wasn't my own. And now I know like this was like the voice of God. And it was like, ask me a question, like, do you want to live? And it wasn't in my voice or like it wasn't like a thought of mine. It was like a very clear, very quiet, gentle thought that I had. And I was like, yes. I thought about it. I was like, yes, I do want to live. And then the same experience that I had, in that hotel, and then again, when that weight was lifted on that back porch, I had that very same experience. And I just knew like everything was going to be okay. And so I went home for Thanksgiving and, voluntarily kind of admitted myself into an inpatient rehab, and I never went back. And, I ended up getting sober, through Alcoholics Anonymous, and, by working, the 12 steps, I ended up like creating discovering my own relationship with God and being connected to the power of God that enabled me to actually like get sober. And that's when things really started to shift. I started going back to church. I started serving in students ministry. I got back into school, ended up graduating and, going into tech, and then, eventually ending up at Google. And nothing is linear, for me. Sanctification and following Jesus has really been so many turns and twists and ups and downs, maybe a step forward and 5 steps back, maybe 5 steps forward, 1 step back. But, the more I surrender, the more I surrender to what God has for my life, the more I look like Jesus and can actually live up to the call that he's placed on my life, And each time I try to do it in my own strength, like I fail, but in that failure, it draws me into like a deeper reliance on God. And I've had to hit a lot of bottoms, the first one was with drugs and alcohol, the second one was with pornography. The third one was with relationships, right? So like all throughout, and even like career and job. And, once I got to Google, I thought like the answer was, getting to the top and, making X amount of money and like, having this life on the outside that looked a certain way. And, each of those foundations that I would build my life on, whether it's career, whether it's money, whether it's sex, whether it's relationships, all of these things eventually had to come tumbling down, right? For me to actually see that like Jesus is really the only firm foundation that I can build life on, And for me, I don't know. They say wisdom is being able to learn from the mistakes of others. I always have to make my own mistakes. And but I'm so thankful for like my entire story along the way, because God has used it for me to help others, and be able to go back and disciple guys that struggle with drugs and alcohol, disciple guys that struggle with porn addiction, disciple guys who idolize relationships and like idolize work and status and money, like all of these things that like God has delivered me from and given me freedom from through following Jesus and like through the Holy Spirit, like working in me. I can then turn around and tell others like how God has set me free from that. And so that's really given me a purpose, is to just help God's kids and like just like testify to the power of God and what he can do in someone's life if you actually lay it down.